They turned me into the scapegoat to protect my brother. A decade later, his own secrets took him down, and I helped. When my parents first told me I had to take the fall for what Peter had done, I didn't scream or cry. I was 18, barely an adult, but I had already learned the family rule: Peter doesn't fail. Ever. You're his older sister, my mother said that night, her voice tight but pleading. You can handle this. And what exactly am I handling? I asked, my voice as calm as I could keep it. My father cut in. Your brother can't afford this kind of scandal before college. You know how important his scholarship is, Rebecca. If the police trace the car to him. Let me stop you there, I interrupted, glaring. You're asking me to take the blame for a hit and run. Are you hearing yourselves? It was an accident, Peter said from the corner of the room, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He didn't look at me. He hadn't since this conversation started. I didn't mean to hit her. She just stepped out. And then you drove away, I snapped. He flinched, but my father's voice rose above us. Enough. Peter has a future to think about. You'll take responsibility, and we'll make sure it's minimized. Community service, maybe probation. Nothing permanent. We'll hire a lawyer. I stared at them, realizing for the first time that my future didn't matter to them. Not like Peter's. But in our family, Peter was the golden boy, the prodigy, the savior. I was just the responsible one, the one they could rely on to keep the peace. And so, I agreed. Not because I believed in him, but because I believed in survival. The scandal blew over quicker than I expected. The girl Peter hit was hospitalized but recovered. My carefully worded confession to the police painted me as a distracted teen driver. I got probation, a suspended license, and a smudge on my record. Peter went off to an Ivy League school 6 months later, unscathed. We barely spoke after that. I stayed in town, working odd jobs while trying to rebuild my life. Thrived, sending home glossy photos of himself in suits at internships and smiling at galas. My parents' pride was nauseating. Then, 10 years later, Peter came home for a visit. And the cracks in his perfect life started to show. It began with a phone call. Rebecca, my mother whispered, her voice shaking. He's in trouble. What kind of trouble? I asked, already wary. I don't know. Something at work. He won't tell me, but he needs money. A lot of it. I laughed bitterly. Let me guess. You want me to help again? You don't understand. No, Mom, I snapped. I understand perfectly. Peter screws up, and I clean up the mess. Isn't that the family tradition? She went silent. But later that night, Peter showed up at my door. He looked different, still polished, but there was a tension in his jaw, a darting unease in his eyes. I need your help, he said, bypassing any pleasantries. Of course you do, I replied, leaning against the doorframe. What is it this time? Fraud? Another accident? Or something darker? His eyes narrowed. This isn't funny, Rebecca. No, it's not. But you don't get to waltz in here after 10 years and expect me to fix your life again. He hesitated, then said quietly, it's blackmail. Someone from work knows things about me, about the firm. If this gets out, I lose everything. Why should I care? I asked. Because you owe me, he snapped, and the audacity of it almost made me laugh. I owe you? You wouldn't have gotten through that probation without us covering the legal fees, he said, his voice cold now. Don't act like you didn't benefit from. From what? I interrupted, stepping closer. Taking the blame for you? Losing my future so you could have yours? You've got some nerve, Peter. But his desperation intrigued me. He had always been so careful, so composed. If someone was threatening to expose him, they had leverage, and I wanted to know what it was. So, I played along. It took weeks of subtle questioning and digging, but eventually, I found the cracks. Peter had been embezzling money from his firm, funneling it into offshore accounts. The blackmailer was a former coworker who'd caught wind of it and demanded a hefty cut to stay silent. How much did you take? I asked him one night, pretending to be sympathetic. Enough, he admitted, rubbing his temples. But I'll pay it back once this blows over. I just need to get rid of this guy. Get rid of him? I repeated, my stomach turning. Peter, what are you saying? Not like that, he muttered. But the look in his eyes told me otherwise. That was the moment I realized I wasn't just dealing with my brother's recklessness anymore. I was dealing with something much darker. I made a plan. The blackmailer's name was Greg. I met him in a dingy cafe under the guise of brokering peace. You don't want to mess with Peter, I told him. He's got resources. Yeah, well, so do I, Greg replied, smirking. How much do you want to walk away? He named a figure, and I pretended to consider it. Then I leaned in. Or, I whispered, you could tell me everything. Every deal, every account number. I promise, it'll be worth your while. He hesitated, but greed won out. He spilled everything. I took what he gave me and went to the authorities. Not to protect Peter, but to expose him. I handed over every document, every detail of his crimes. When the news broke, my parents called me in a panic. How could you let this happen? My mother cried. Let it happen? I repeated, my voice cold. I made it happen. They were silent. Peter was arrested 2 weeks later. The evidence was airtight. When he realized it was me who had turned him in, he called me from jail. Why? He asked, his voice. Because you made me the scapegoat once, I replied. And I've spent 10 years cleaning up your messes. But this time, I cleaned it up for good. For the first time in his life, Peter had no words. Watching him fall didn't bring me joy, but it brought me closure. For the first time, I was free, from him, from my family's expectations, from the shadows of his mistakes. And Peter? He finally got to face the consequences he'd spent his whole life avoiding. Peter was arrested 2 weeks later. The evidence was airtight. When he realized it was me who had turned him in, he called me from jail. Rebecca, it was you, he said, his voice a mix of shock and anger. I didn't respond immediately. I wanted him to stew for a moment, to realize how long I'd carried the weight of his actions. Yeah, I said finally. It was me. He laughed bitterly. Why would you do this to me? After everything? I leaned against the kitchen counter, gripping the phone tightly, trying to control the sudden rush of emotions that threatened to take over. After everything? You mean, after you left me to take the blame for that accident? After you made me sacrifice my future just to protect your precious reputation? You chose to do that, he shot back, his voice rising. You agreed. You said you'd take care of it. What changed? What changed? I repeated the words slowly. What changed as I realized I was the one carrying everything, while you just kept getting away with it. I lost everything for you, Peter. And what did I get in return? You lying to Mom and Dad, pretending like you didn't know how bad things were getting for me. That's not fair, he snapped. You were the one who got the easy way out. I had to keep everything together. I had to keep it all running while you sat back and pretended like I didn't have a right to my success. You think this is about your success? I felt the anger building in my chest. You think this is about me being jealous of you? You've always been able to take the credit while I was left cleaning up your messes. But this time, Peter, I wasn't going to clean up for you anymore. I don't believe this, he muttered, almost to himself. I don't believe you'd do this to me. You're my sister, Rebecca. You were supposed to have my back. Have your back? I almost laughed, though there was no humor in it. You've never had mine. You've always made sure you were protected, no matter who you hurt in the process. I'm just the one who had to pick up the pieces. I've spent my life picking up your pieces. That's not true, he shouted, his voice rising again. You think you're the only one who sacrificed? I've worked for everything I have. You think I didn't work for Mom and Dad, for the family? You worked for you, Peter, I said, my voice calm, almost detached now. You did what you needed to do to stay ahead, and you used everyone around you to do it. But when it came down to it, you couldn't even own up to your mistakes. You had me take the fall for you. And I'm done. I'm done being your scapegoat. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear him breathing heavily, the realization sinking in. Then, finally, he spoke, his voice quieter. You know, I never meant for things to get this far. I didn't mean for it to end like this. Of course you didn't, I said, my words coming out colder than I intended. You never meant for anything to get this far. You just kept pushing the line, crossing boundaries, until you finally ran out of people to use. And I was the last one left. I let the silence stretch on, letting him digest my words. When he finally spoke again, it wasn't with anger or defensiveness. It was a rare, almost vulnerable tone. I don't know what to do now. I thought I could fix it, fix everything. Peter, you can't fix what you've broken. You had your chance. And you took that away from me. But I'm your brother, he whispered. And that's why it had to be me, I said softly. Because I was the only one left who could stop you. You might be my brother, but you're also the person who taught me to never let anyone else control my life. Not even you. He was quiet for a long time after that. When he finally spoke, it was barely a whisper. I'm sorry. I exhaled slowly, staring out the window. The weight of it all didn't feel lighter, but it felt final. I had done what I needed to do. You should have been sorry a long time ago. I hung up the phone and sat in the silence of the apartment, feeling more empty than relieved. But I knew, for the first time in my life, I had finally chosen myself.